I'm the student co-chair. We just want to remind you before we get started here that we do have events scheduled all week long. Okay. Including tomorrow at noon, we have Hilda Paki at noon in the gallery. And then tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, we have Karina Horta in this room, the sunroom. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Randall Robinson as the keynote speaker. He is the founder and executive director of Trans-Africa, the national lobbying organization for Africa and the Caribbean. Trans-Africa is a foreign policy, education, advocacy organization. Trans-Africa mobilized opposition to the apartheid to pass the Anti-Apartheid Act over President Reagan's veto. He is the executive director of Trans-Africa Forum, which is founded to collect, analyze, and disseminate information about Africa and the Caribbean and the U.S. foreign policy affecting these regions. So without further ado, Mr.
Is this thing working? I'll warn you in advance that I have the stiff neck and I can only look to my left. That says nothing about my politics. I am very happy to be here to talk on this important subject. Not only am I happy to be here, but I'm especially glad that this is happening at Iowa State University, because the key to a range of problems that I think we in the United States have as a society in our relations with other nations and other peoples is in education. Americans know very little about the rest of the world. Many years ago, when the Congress was debating the issue of Rhodesia, before Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, the fight was raging in the country and the freedom fighters were getting support from neighboring states. And a member of Congress from Missouri, I recall, before a packed gallery, rose on the floor of the House because he was very upset about these neighboring states that were giving aid to these guerrillas, and he said to his distinguished colleagues, we have to do something about the nations of Mali and Zambodia. Nobody in the Congress chuckled, but they were all concerned about Mali and Zambodia. And until a few weeks ago, I thought perhaps things had improved until Senator Exxon rose on the floor of the Senate and said we have to do something about our involvement in Somalia. And then another member of the Senate behind him and said, yes, and we have to curtail our aid to the Somalians. This is an extraordinary thing, all punctuated by Ronald Reagan's trip after his first term to Latin America when he toasted the people of the wrong country. And when he was told he wasn't in that country, he said that's where he was going next, and he wasn't going there at all. They did a poll not too many years ago to measure for global sophistication amongst the peoples of the industrialized nations of the world, and the United States finished at the absolute bottom. 1 in 8 Americans could not find the U.S. on a world map. Now, the combination of power and ignorance is a dangerous combination indeed. When one lives in a totalitarian society, it is helpful to know nothing. It is dangerous to think. It is not encouraged. You do what you're told. Totalitarianism means that the government pervades every aspect of society. You're told what to do and when to do it, sort of like being in the army. You're told which sock to put on which foot. In a democratic society, The democracy can only be as healthy as the citizenry knows about public affairs. For it is our responsibility to make our policymakers account to us for what they do. And so you cannot have a healthy democracy without an enlightened citizenry. Most Americans come to foreign policy like my brother and I, when we were children, used to go to the movies. This was before some of you my age and older remember what it was like going to the movies before they started this barbaric practice of emptying the theater after each showing. We never consulted any movie schedule. We just went in the movie. Didn't make any difference whether it was at the end of the movie, the middle of the movie, or the beginning, because we're going to see the thing 6 times anyhow. Now, if you can go to movies like that, you certainly can't come to foreign policy like that. Most Americans never heard of Iraq before it was Iraq. We never heard of Panama. We never heard of South Korea. We never heard of Vietnam. We never heard of Somalia. We never heard of these things before they evolved as crises, and they came upon us through news media. And then we were expected to participate in national debate. I saw on the Iraq question during the war, Charlton Heston in a debate with a British expert on the role of the West Allied powers in the war against Saddam Hussein. And he was asked by the British chap to name one country that bordered Iraq. He must have stabbed at 20 nations before he came within 500 miles of Iraq. He didn't have a clue about what he was talking about. Well, you just can't have a healthy democracy with that level of public debate. And so, in order to know where our country is going and what our responsibility ought to be in the rest of the world, we have to develop an enlightened citizenry. And for that reason, I am pleased about what you're doing in Iowa. And I always tell young people that the first thing you have to do to complete your educations is to get out of Iowa and then get out of the United States. Travel, go somewhere, meet other people, read other newspapers, cultivate a respect for other languages, other religions, other cultures. See the world from the outside in. See the U.S. that way. You know, some few of you, most of you forget everything you study immediately after you take your exams. Some poor few of you forget everything you've studied before you take your exams. But you will never forget what you learn in travel. You have to see other societies, go somewhere else to live, and then you will develop a global appreciation of the way our world works and the sensitivities we need to bring to the process to make our country more responsive to the interest of the world. Now, getting to Africa and the current dilemma. It is unfortunate in many respects that African countries came to independence during the Cold War. They never had a chance. They were on an uneven playing field. American policy over the last 30 years has been largely controlled by two forces. First, there is the determinant of Soviet containment. And then there is the imperative of race in the making of American foreign policy. Race, although less visible as the determinant, is nonetheless important. But the all-consuming preoccupation with Soviet containment really marked American policy. And if you wanted assistance from the United States, all you had to do was to say you were anti-Soviet. So you were on one side or the other. And as a consequence of that, we have never, with any seriousness of purpose, assisted any democracies in Africa in any way of consequence over the last 30 years. The lion's share of American foreign assistance went to 6 countries: Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, and Zaire. When I was a child, before I understood these things, I thought Haile Selassie in Ethiopia was a wonderful fellow. He was on television as much as Howdy Doody. He worked for us. He was an American employee. He was anti-Soviet, and we armed him to the teeth. All of these years, you know, I was not aware that Somalia was a functioning, viable society. Mogadishu was established in the 11th century. And the Somalis have always treasured as a kind of national resource the business of language and poetry, a pastoral, working, peaceful society. And then they had colonialism. The country was divided between the British and the Italians. And after the colonial period, they had 9 years of fractious, flawed, but working democracy, which was overthrown by a lowly colonel in the Italian colonial police force whose name was Siad Barre. When Siad Barre came to power, he was neither capitalist nor communist. He was a fellow who wanted power. And he looked about and he said, where from can I get assistance to form this dictatorship and to keep it going and to put this country under my fist? And he looked across the border at Somalia's archenemy, Ethiopia, and saw that Haile Selassie had already been employed by us. And when he saw that, he knew he couldn't get American assistance, and then declared himself communist. And then Somalia at that point started its descent into hell. For the Soviet Union began to load arms into Somalia. Some years later, Haile Selassie was overthrown by Mengistu, who was a leftist. We couldn't give arms to a leftist. And it's almost as if the United Nations delegate from the US and the delegate from the Soviet Union met in the lounge in the General Assembly, winked at each other, and we switched sides. Then the Soviets started to give arms to Mengistu. And beginning in 1977, ironically enough, with the presidency of Jimmy Carter, we started to give aid and arms to Siad Barre, sustaining his 21-year dictatorship. From 1977 to 1989, we gave to this ruthless dictator $887 million in American foreign assistance, including $200 million in arms, tanks, recoilless rifles, surface-to-air missiles, military training. If he needed it, he got it from us, all in exchange for American use of a tiny airstrip at Berbera on the Gulf of Aden, from which Mr. Brzezinski, then the National Security Advisor, was interested that we would have rights to launch rapid deployment missions into the Middle East. With the Soviet weaponry and with our weaponry, Siad Barre destroyed his country. And when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Empire came apart, we no longer had any use for Siad Barre, and we fired him. And then he collapsed, but he collapsed on Somalia. And all of the arms that were in the country were divided between militia leaders scrambling to make themselves as powerful as Siad Barre had been for the last 21 years. And so a country that was a pastoral society became an armed camp. A country that was a working society became a battlefield. Young boys who used to ride around on the backs of camels in a pastoral, peaceful society now ride around on technicals with Uzis and AK-47s. Then Americans ask themselves the question, how did we get involved in Somalia? You know, so many of us see African societies through the prism of our own parochialism, our own racism. We look for no past. We look only at the present. We understand Africa with a Tarzan kind of analysis. Isn't Somalia a mess? When people ask me what is wrong with Somalia or what happened to Somalia, the simple answer is that we happened to Somalia. But I would bet you not 1 in 50 Americans has a clue about Somalia's evolution, its descent into this mess. Certainly not Senator Exxon talking about Somalia and the Somalians. But there are other Somalias in Africa. Sudan is a Somalia where we aided Nimeri. Kenya is a Somalia where we've aided Arab Moi. Liberia is a Somalia where in the 1980s we gave $500 million to a 5th grade sergeant in arms with which he overthrew a democracy and destroyed his country and caused the wreckage of Liberia that we see today. Zaire is a Somalia. 30 years ago, we imposed, and this is no sort of charge from the left unsubstantiated. Our State Department people take full responsibility for it. It's an open matter that Mr. Mobutu was imposed by our CIA on the people of Zaire. And so while many of us blame the people of Zaire for their trouble, the fact is because the Cold War was raging, the people of Zaire were never given a choice to make. We installed Mobutu, and with American support and with American weapons, he has looted his country. He is the world's perhaps most effective kleptocrat, worth $5 or $6 billion. The only man I know who has crystal chandeliers hanging on the outside of his house, who uses the national banking system as his own personal checking account, who believes that every Zairean woman on his election would be his wife, destroyed his country and helped to destroy Angola and other countries. Angola is a country to the south about the size of Texas, 9 million people. Most Angolans have never known a day of peace. 500 years of Portuguese colonialism in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. And somewhere in the early 1960s, Africans in those countries took up arms to win their freedom. But we were on the wrong side of the issue, largely because the Soviet Union was on the other side. We decided to support continued and sustained Portuguese colonialism in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. And we supported companies like Gulf Oil that became Chevron, that gave the Portuguese all the wherewithal they needed to continue that war to sustain colonialism in these countries. And then Portugal collapsed, and Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau won their independence. But then a civil war started because we were afraid the country would fall into the hands of leftists. Then we gave all of our support in Angola to a man named Jonas Savimbi. We knew then that this fella was doing unspeakable human rights wrongs to the people in his country. But we gave him every weapon imaginable. And as a result of that, although everybody in the world had come to recognize the government of Angola, even Margaret Thatcher recognized the government of Angola, we could not find it in our hearts, in a country that recognized the Soviet Union, could not find it in its heart to recognize a country that was receiving assistance from the Soviet Union. I don't know of a white country in the world that we refused recognition to in the way that we refused it to Angola. And as a result, 9 million people, 500,000 dead in a war that never ends, with the largest per capita amputee population on earth. And sadly, most Americans wouldn't know Angola from a hubcap. No clue about where it is. Sometimes I'm surprised when I talk to Nelson Mandela about how wonderfully free of bitterness this man is. After spending 28 years of his life behind bars, the whole shank of his adult life, largely not because of the policies of 4 million whites, but because of the policies of the West. We had this notion of identifying anybody who received support from the other side as communists, when we wouldn't give them support. I remembered when Eduardo Mondlane, who was from Mozambique, was teaching at Syracuse University many years ago, and he got the call to come home saying the war was starting in Mozambique and he needed support, and he went to President Kennedy and he said, "Mr. President, America has always stood for the right things, for democracy and freedom. My people have endured 500 years of colonialism. Will you help us?" President Kennedy said, "We want you to be free, but we cannot help you." From that day to this, we have never provided a single African with a single bullet to win a single freedom. But the Soviets did, and the Chinese did. They positioned themselves on the right moral side of the issue. And in point of fact, we as a nation did not. Mandela knew that. South Africa had no weapons to speak of. The West gave them that. It had no nuclear technology. The West gave them that. It had no financial base. Major lending institutions in the West gave them that. It had no real enduring economic strength. Western trade gave them that. We were the legs on which apartheid stood. And for all those years, Mandela was in prison. The anti-apartheid activists in the West fought and struggled to make this country impose sanctions, knowing that until we got on the right side of the issue, South African whites would never listen. Not because anybody has any copyright on virtue. Lord knows we've seen enough to know that blacks can be vicious to other blacks, whites can be vicious to other whites. People who have power, unchecked, always abuse it. It is not a racial phenomenon. It has nothing to do with morality. Being right is not enough. I remembered when I was in law school, when I was a young man, you know, when you're young, you're full of all sorts of silly notions. And at the time, I had a field jacket I wore every day and an afro so big I could camp a snowstorm on my head. And I recall standing up in my law school corporations class just waxing hot about the iniquity of apartheid and American involvement. And the thing, you know, the speech I was given, you know, sometimes you get on a roll, the thing was disembodied. It was like somebody else speaking. The thing was out there talking to us all. I had no control over it. The thing it was pyramidal, and it started to unfold, then it took its own shape. It had a certain brilliance and portrait. It was cogent. God, I was astounded. Who is saying this? And then when I finished it all, I threw it down like a gauntlet, said, "So that, what?" My corporation's teacher told me, "Mr. Robinson, that's very nice, but the divinity school is 1 block down and 2 blocks over." Being right has nothing to do with anything. And powerful nations make mistakes and plow them under and keep on rolling. We have made an awful lot of mistakes that have cost lives in many parts of the world. Our work in Somalia that started on the right foot has ended up at this point rather badly. In large part because we never came out of our Cold War notions of deciding who would lead what. It's almost as if we really don't believe in democracy for anything but people who live in the West. On other people, we feel that we can't give them the discretion of choice. It's if we are supposed to choose their leadership for them. Ambassador Oakley had done a good job in Somalia. With Operation Restore Hope, he talked to everybody. There are 6 major clans in Somalia. And the clans, the amazing thing about Somalia is that the Somalis all speak Somali. And they all are Muslims. And no Somali can look at another Somali and tell whether that Somali is Hawiye or Isak or Darat or this or that. Clans are like major extended families that go well back into Somali history. And they have always existed with some tension, but in some relative state of balanced power, before that balance was destroyed during the 21-year dictatorship of Siad Barre. And so we all thought at the beginning of this process, we should feed people, yes, but at the same time we should try to effect a voluntary disarmament in the country to get the weapons out of the country, but to do it with a studiously approached impartiality. The sine qua non of effective peacekeeping is impartiality. And when we transferred from Restore Hope to UNISOM, and Oakley was replaced by Admiral Howe, and Admiral Howe brought with him from the State Department April Glaspie. Many of you may remember April Glaspie from Iraq fame. She has become the typhoid Mary of American foreign policy. And she immediately, upon arriving in Somalia, signaled her favor for a man named Mohammed Abshir and her hostility to Aidid, so that while Oakley talked to everybody, we stopped talking to Aidid. Now, one is making no brief for Aidid. I happen to think that all of the militia leaders have done enormous damage to Somalia in their quest for power. But if we are to get one militia representing this subclan or that clan to disarm, we must make sure that everybody understands that it is a uniform disarmament that we are trying to undertake. We didn't do that. We made it apparent enough that we had one favorite and one man towards whom we had hostility, and then pushed him and his subclan beyond the pale. Disaster followed. For his subclan, he is something of a hero, and more or less democratically chosen by them upon his call back from India, where he was ambassador under Siad Barre. No charming fella, no saint, but he still represents a group of people in that country with which we have to deal. But we didn't consult with the people in Eritrea. We didn't consult with their president. We didn't consult with President Meles of Ethiopia. We didn't consult with Museveni of Uganda. We didn't consult with the people in the region who knew a lot more about Somalia than we did. And I have to believe almost that we thought that soon as the first American touched soil and popped up with an M16 rifle, all of the Africans would run for the hills. I don't know what American intelligence gathers, but it is not intelligence. For it's clear, Somalis fought against the Japanese during World War II from 43 to 45 without a single surrender. Somalis have this belief in their tenacity militarily with toughness to the death. We did not know what we were dealing with in Somalia. These are not run for the hills people. And so it would behoove us when we're going to any country, not only to know what the people are called and what the name of their country is, but just a little bit about the society with which we're trying to relate. That is why what you're doing here is so important. And now we're having from the halls of Congress this call to get out of Somalia and turn it over to the United Nations. Now, this is perhaps the dumbest advice of all, largely because we seem to believe that United Nations troops come from Mars. We are members of the United Nations. That at the end of the Cold War, we had a mess globally, a mess produced by the Cold War. And so we have a mess in Guatemala, we have a mess in Salvador, we have a mess in Nicaragua, we have a mess in Cambodia, we have a mess in Afghanistan, we have the messes in Africa, all produced by the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And is the world to go to hell in a handbasket? One asks the question, what is it to do with us? Well, if we don't deal with Somalia, if we don't help it to right itself and restore its governmental sense, if we don't do that, it will claim the nascent, incipient democracies in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and all of these other countries that are being overrun by refugees from Somalia. You will see arms trafficking. You will see instability throughout the Horn of Africa, and it will find its way back home to us. And so the thought was, the best way to address this problem was through the United Nations. If the United States was not prepared to police the world, how could it be done? It would have to be done multilaterally with the United Nations. And so the United Nations, ready or not, and it's not ready because there's been no dress rehearsal. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's trying to learn what it's doing. 80,000 troops from 74 countries and 14 peacekeeping operations globally, of which Somalia is just one. And so we say, get out of the United Nations, get out of Somalia. What does that mean for the rest of the world? What does that mean for our role in it? Great powers cannot retreat from the world. We have to play our role responsibly. Most of us, someone told me the other night, while we are funding the United Nations, we ought to be able to run it as we please. Next year, the United Nations will spend $4.3 billion on peacekeeping. This isn't gin, is it? This is water. $4.3 billion in peacekeeping operations. It's already in debt $1.1 billion. And the number one deadbeat in paying its debt to the United Nations is the United States. We owe the UN in peacekeeping operations $768 million, followed closely by the Soviet Union. It's pouring like it's gin. And so the point of all of this is to say that to the extent that Americans follow these issues, we can cause our members of Congress to participate thoughtfully in the formulation of American policy. To the extent that we follow these issues and cause us to be the kind of country that we should be, we can rid our policy of the kind of racism that has stamped it, the kind of stupefying insensitivity that often mocks it. When I talk about race in our policy, I talk about an issue illustratively like Haiti. It sometimes shows up graphically in our admission of people to the United States as refugees. You know, a refugee is not an immigrant. If I'm an immigrant, I want to move to France, I want to change my national address, I've got to prove I can pull my weight in France, and so I've got to show my resume that I've got a job, how much money I've got in the bank, and that sort of thing. I move to France, and no drag on the government. Immigrants pack bags, sell homes, ship cars. Refugees don't pack any bags, they run. A refugee is somebody who is fleeing in fear for one's life. And under international law, all member nations of the family of nations have a lawful responsibility, indeed an obligation, to provide a safe haven to any refugee fleeing for fear for one's life. From 1981 to 1990, at the top of our list, we accepted in the United States 76% of the Soviets who applied. At the very bottom of our list, we accepted 1.1% of the Haitians. From 81 to 1990, we interdicted 22,940 Haitians on the seas in flimsy boats with the knowledge that only 1 in 2 of them had a chance to make it to these shores alive. Of the 22,940, we allowed only 11 to even apply for political asylum in the United States. And then George Bush imposed the policy of the cordon to round up any Haitian on the high seas and to return that person to Port-au-Prince. Indeed, if President Aristide were caught in a boat today, he would be taken back to Port-au-Prince. And if we find a Cuban and a Haitian on the same boat, under the Cuban Adjustment Act, we take the Cuban off the boat and bring the Cuban to Miami. We take the Haitian immediately back to Port-au-Prince. In 1991, 1992, we accepted every Pole and every Czech who applied for political asylum in the United States. It is no accident that the Statue of Liberty sits in New York facing Europe and not in Miami facing Haiti. Race is a major determinant in the making of American foreign policy. And so it pays to know. One cannot struggle about and against wrongs about which one knows nothing. It is not enough to be right. Right people lose all the time. The hallmark of a fair and decent and working democracy is education and activism. Learn, study, understand our national ideals, and make our national practices conform to those ideals. From the days of slavery, ignorance was a useful tool used by slave owners to keep us from learning to read. The people who wield power in the world today have no greater interest in global education than did slave owners. For well-informed people make trouble. But trouble makes for a stronger democracy, a better America, and a more decent world. That is why I'm so pleased that you're doing this, having these kinds of discussions in our heartland of American democracy. Make our nation account to us and the rest of the world. People are starving needlessly. People are dying needlessly. The right policy in the right direction could make all the difference. My friend President Aristide waits to go home. He was elected by 70% of his people. He could go home tomorrow if President Clinton had the moxie to really pose a viable threat to the military regime that has hijacked his country. Nelson Mandela looks forward to elections in April, in which we expect, if they come off, to make him the first black president of his country. But only then will his work begin. South Africa has 7 million of 28 million blacks living in self-erected shacks. It has 50% unemployment in the black community. It has no health care and education system to speak of for the vast majority of its people. If they can't deliver on those issues, its democracy will be hollow. Will we be prepared to give as much to them as we've given to Russia and Eastern Europe? Will we be prepared to do in a colorblind way what is the right thing to do in democracies wherever they flower? The answer is really in our hands. Elected officials are not leaders. They don't make the parade, they simply run to find the front of it. In my experiences, politicians stand for essentially one thing: re-election. We make the parade. Idealists, people who learn, people who care. We ended the Vietnam War. We produced the Civil Rights Movement. We imposed sanctions against South Africa that cost that economy anywhere from $10 to $50 billion. And we knew well that only then did white South Africans do a policy check, say to themselves, now is the time to negotiate. It comes from the bottom up. It comes from us. I thank you very much. Am I supposed to take questions? I'm supposed to take questions.
And then we'll have a reception in this room.
Yes.
I would like to know what you feel about how much United States foreign policy in Africa, towards the so-called third world, has changed since the Cold War. Because I operate from the premise that the U.S. government always used the ideological justification of the Cold War to intervene in other countries. For example, according to that's why we killed the people of El Salvador, while telling the U.S. people that you're fighting Russian soldiers, even though there's no Russian soldiers in El Salvador. For the example of Cuba, for 30 years we were told we had to have this blockade against Cuba and military aggression against Cuba because the Soviet Union was there. Now the Soviet Union is pulled out of Cuba 3 years ago, and the United States stopped.
No, I don't think it's just the business of the Soviet Union. We had a warmer relationship with the Soviet Union than we had with many of the Soviet Union's clients. We never did to the Soviet Union what we've done for the last 30 years virtually to the Cubans. We're Cuba's natural trading partner, and this embargo has been in place all of these years. Cuba is poor largely because of American policies. I think we have been hostile to all places that have not declared themselves safe places for American private investment. You know, the business of America is business. And if you pose anything of a threat to that, it's not analogous, but let me give you the situation just for purposes of illustration. In Haiti, what is at issue in Haiti? You have a Haitian elite, almost racially distinct, people who are of Middle Eastern descent with some mixture of African blood, but largely in the main lighter than the rest of the Haitians, who are very wealthy, a few families. And they developed this collaboration with the military. That has really run things in Haiti for the last 200 years. You've never had any democracy to speak of. All of a sudden, we have the first democratic election in Haiti's history. And they elect a diminutive priest who actually is a man of God, meaning that he's no hypocrite about this thing. He actually believes this stuff. And Americans are not really used to people who take religion seriously. I mean, we do it as a social convention, generally. But here was a guy who really believed this. And so he was elected by the poor of Haiti to see to the interest of those people. Well, the wealthy people felt immediately threatened because Haiti is not a country with so many resources that you don't have to take from Peter to pay Paul. And so they thought they were threatened immediately. And in addition, you have these people from the Duvalier period in the army, the neo-Macoutes, of the Tonton Macoutes, that he would take out of those positions. These people have been making enormous sums of money in drug traffic transshipment through Haiti. And so he threatened both groups. he had to go. And they called him a communist, they called him everything. And now Henry Kissinger and General Scowcroft and the CIA are saying the man's a lunatic, he's unstable, he's human rights problems and all this sort of thing. Well, if this man's a lunatic, so is most of the Congress. I mean, I've known the man well for a long time. He's had dinner at my house. He's as sane as anybody in this room. And he's also very brave and very decent and very committed to the uplift of the wretched majority that most Haitians live in this kind of awful condition. And so that's a threat. And so I think in so many countries where people began to make sort of socialist soundings about you need to have these kinds of programs to see to the poor, we may tax this corporation, your corporation can't do this and that in my country, this sort of, even if you're a social democrat like Michael Manley was in Jamaica. I mean, Michael had in his first term the cheek to say what corporations